Next slide, please. So we just want to recognize again our partners for this afternoon and for the whole CLP session. I'm seeing Jakarta Research Council, ICLAY. They've been very helpful for us co-developing this program, specifically at ICLAY Southeast Asia and East Asia offices. I'm seeing Arcus City, CDP. Thank you for the positive reception to develop this program. And also we have our local partner in Indonesia, GreenNet. Next slide, please. So just a quick reminder again for CLP participants, during the open forum, please send your questions in the Q&A chat room. The webinar facilitator will manage your questions in the chat room. And of course, all our presentation materials in PDF format will be uploaded in the CityNet website for easy access. Visit our website after 2 or 3 days after each CLP session. And a certification of completion statement will be issued to the participants who will successfully complete the program. And please bear with the organizers if technical lag and web connection issues arise during the program. Let us know through the chat room if audio and video reception need improvement. And the CLP webinar is being recorded live as well. Next slide, please. So again, as a requirement for the certification of completion, participant is encouraged to post questions during the open forum. You must be able to attend in the 3 sessions. Participant will answer the 3 feedback exercises as the minimum requirement. Please refer to the Zoom feedback email at the end of each session. And the deadline for the CLP session 2 feedback is on September 24, 2020, 6 p.m. Korean Standard Time. Next slide, please. So let's proceed to our formal program, but let me have the privilege to formally introduce to you our facilitator for this afternoon session, CLP2. Maria Adelaida Antolet-Sea is the Technical Advisor Coordinator of Cities and Climate Change Initiative Asia and the Pacific UN Habitat Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. She has more than 2 decades of development work experience in the areas of urban environment and settlements planning, disaster risk management, climate change action planning, and policy advocacy. Following her work with various civil society organizations in the Philippines, Ms. Sea started working with UN Habitat in 2005 and became the Asia Pacific Regional Coordinator of UN Habitat's Cities and Climate Change Initiative in 2009. In such capacity, she provides technical advisory and support to partner countries in the Asia-Pacific region on climate change actions and policy development. She likewise works directly with communities and local government authorities in developing climate change assessments and action plans and in mainstreaming the same into their existing development plans, policies, and investment programs. So we welcome Ms. Lides, as I call her, Ms. Maria Adelaida Antolet-Sea, to facilitate for the whole session and to also provide for our context setting. So you can take it away, Ms. Lides. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to the attendees of this very interesting session under the Climate Leadership Program of CityNet. I have the pleasure of moderating this afternoon session, but just to set the context for everyone and for everybody to step back to better understand where we're coming from, why we're discussing carbon finance this afternoon, let me just share with you the landmark agreement on the Paris agreement that we have and which was ratified by nations. So this basically sets the goal for all of us when we are addressing climate change. Or there are 3 basic aims of the Paris Agreement. One is very famous. We want to, of course, hold the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, pre-industrial level, and also pursuing the efforts to limit it to 1.5 pre-industrial level. So apart from that, it is acknowledged that the Paris Agreement should be leading us to more adaptive capacities so that we will be able to address the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience and low carbon development. A rather not too famous or not too talked about or well understood target of the Paris Agreement is making finance flow consistent with the pathway that we want as we achieve resilience and low emission development. So with that, can you go to the next slide, please? A lot of the cities, a lot of national governments are pursuing to further ensure that indeed climate finance will flow, and this could be a means to implement adaptation and mitigation action. IPCC AR5 also, for the first time in all its previous reports, have a specific chapter on investments and finance. And I particularly wanted it here because I wanted everyone to know that when you talk about climate finance, there are a whole gamut of actors expected to work on it. And we're not just talking about instruments, we're talking about the capital itself, the finance itself, those who are managing those funding, and the instruments to make it flow, whether through grants, loans, or other methodologies or mechanisms that global agreements has facilitated to be instituted so that finance will indeed flow, even before it reaches the sponsor and supports the project. So while the IPCC AR5 had a lot of scientific information, this to me is very interesting for this discussion that we're having this afternoon. So the key highlights of the chapter talks about the need for the finance, and that private sector indeed plays a lot in terms of the processes and the flow of finance that could happen to finance mitigation and adaptation actions. One of the key things that it also said is that, can you go to the next slide? There is no global definition or common definition yet that is easily applied by all whenever they are defining climate finance or carbon finance. So for that, let me just pick how UNFCCC defines climate finance, which is more general, and it refers to all the local, national, transnational funding drawn from public, private, or even alternative resources that supports mitigation and adaptation action finance. We are now in this afternoon talking about carbon finance. I suppose our distinguished speakers will be discussing that in detail, but just to pick up how the World Bank defines it, carbon finance is actually the generic term used to describe or used to define the revenue streams or the resources that can be generated from low carbon projects and activities from the sale of their greenhouse gas emissions reductions, which either was done through reduction by source or removal through sinks or even trading carbon credits. So zooming in on Asia, a lot of the climate finance mechanisms are actually funded by carbon funds. And you would see that borrowing it from this latest update from the climate funds update, there are various climate financing mechanisms or initiatives that are funding actions on the ground and in nations. So this, if you would see, there are only about very few, it's not even reaching 200 projects yet that is financed out of all the mechanisms being applied in Asia to finance climate actions. CTF, or the Clean Technology Fund, seem to be the highest in terms of contribution to climate finance, including GCF, all the other financing mechanisms that is being applied in different countries. What's interesting also to note is out of this finance, mitigation, the general context of mitigation projects is getting the funding, a lot of the portions of the funding available for different countries. And in this context, the recent OECD report before the COP last year says that funding from developed countries to developing countries in Asia are on an upward trend. So we'll see. But then the question today for all of us, for our distinguished panel of speakers to further provide to the participants today is, how is this climate finance or carbon finance really going to support the sustainable development targets as well as the climate targets of not only countries but cities? How can they take advantage of this and use this as an opportunity? What are the challenges faced at the national level, perhaps international level, or even cities when it comes to accessing and using carbon finance to support their project? So as Polly said, this afternoon we have 4 distinguished speakers who will join us to further detail this. and provide you more insights in terms of the context of carbon financing, and also, more importantly, share experiences as this is applied in country and on the ground. So without further ado, the first bit of our session will have as first speaker Mr. Paul Butar-Butar, who is the founder and director of PT3GT Service Indonesia, and he's going to talk about mitigation and carbon finance development. So if you're ready, Paul, you can take the floor and further detail what carbon finance is really all about for our participants.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Sorry. So you can see my screen now?
Yes, Paul, we can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, thank you for inviting me to this event, an honor for me. And also, it's good to know some people that also very well known in the climate space and so, and also happy to meet you all. So I'm asked to give the presentation about the mitigation and carbon finance development for this event. It was already introduced about the Paris Agreement that before decision 1, and we know that about 71% to 76% of global greenhouse gas emission and around 67 to 76 global energy consumption is actually in the cities. And we know that the main contributors is actually energy for transport, buildings, and also waste. I take up some example from the report provided by ICLEI. The city of Balikpapan, for example, that the majority of emissions is from stationary energy, power plants, and also from transportation. Similar figure in Bogor, other city in Indonesia, although this time the biggest emissions comes from transportation, while the power plants is a bit less, but it is followed by waste. And then if we look at the NDC, I take an example of NDC in Indonesia, that energy in the future will become the major emission contributor for Indonesia. You can see, for example, under the business as usual scenario, there will be about 1.7 billion ton of CO2 emissions. We would like to reduce that by 300 in the energy sector only by 314 million ton of CO2. And if we look at the, let's say, in the energy sector in the NDC of Indonesia, there is, for example, the energy efficiency, including the transportation, will be put as one of the priority for the reduction. The same with using of biofuel and in the transportation. And if we compare that with other countries, we see that in the NDC, for example, out of 164 NDCs that have been submitted, 113 NDC mention about actions in the cities. We can see some example of what can be done in the city. In the energy supply, for example, that could be focusing on the use of renewable energy, PV rooftop, or street lighting, in the energy demand, or let's say going to use green building, develop green building, also electric vehicle, public transport, and so on. And then if we as well as waste, for example, if you compare the city like Jakarta with about 30 million people during the day and about 10 million during the night, the total waste that has to be managed is about more than 7,000 tons per day. So this becomes a source of huge emissions for a city like Jakarta. And if we look at this is the report from World Bank mentioning the what would be the focus of the let's say mitigations in the city. We see that the decarbonization of the electricity grid is one of the important aspects, where especially in the cities where the supply mostly come from let's say fossil-based. Like Jakarta and other big cities in Asia. And then there will be in the demand side is the optimizing the energy use in the building standard, green building standard, and then the using of cooling and heating, lighting upgrade, using the LEDs and so on. And then come next will be transportations. We are talking about the use of mass rapid transport and cycling and so on, and then we have improving waste management. The other emission reduction potentials that is available is, for example, using let's say this small picture that I take from Jakarta, using the electric vehicle for let's say goods food transportations. They have so Grab, for example, has signed a kind of MOU with a local manufactured motorcycle to provide electric vehicle to transport food. Especially this has been done during the COVID. So carbon finance, can carbon finance really provide financing for greenhouse gas mitigation in the cities? So if you look at for these slides, for example, we have the carbon market. We have, let's say, a buyer and also sellers. And with the buyer, for example, they use carbon credit to offset their emissions. They are, let's say, companies that do some mitigation activities and generate CO2. Then they can sell the certificate to those in needs. We have, for example, again here, enterprise with low emission reduction cost, just like the in the past, that's with the CDM, and there are in enterprise with high emission reduction cost in the Europe, for example. These companies in developing country, for example, can introduce or develop emission reduction projects, and then they generate carbon credit, and they can sell that to Europe. Until 2012, there are still a lot of companies from developing countries that sell carbon credit to Europe. But now, for the compliance purposes, it's not allowed anymore by EU, except if it is from the project in least developed countries. This is one project that we have developed in Indonesia, geothermal project, capacity upgrade from 3 times 55 megawatt. It goes to 3 times 60 megawatt by improving the turbine of the geothermal power plant. And they generate about 100,000 carbon credit per year. But this project only sell carbon credit to voluntary markets because of the conditions or preconditions that set in the CDM in the past. So how to generate carbon credit? This is the process that normally will be done depending on the mechanism or standard that they use. You have to have a kind of methodology. You have to prepare project design documents. In terms of CDM, you have to follow, you have to get approval from a national authority and get the approval from executive board. And then if it is, for example, using VCA standard, you don't need approval number 5 and 6 will not be required. Also, for VCS number 9 will not be required. But for example, GCM follow this similar model. You have to have methodology, prepared documentation, and then someone will come for validation and verification later on. Then someone will, let's say, issue the carbon credit. So we expect that in the future, for Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, for example, with the new mechanism, similar model will need to be followed. You have to have methodology, documentation, and so on. But it is not decided how. So who are the buyers? For example, I put here some let's say graphic that we have here. Domestic market, just thinking about, for example, in Indonesia, we are now discussing, or government discussed about the introduction of carbon pricing. That could be ETS and tax, and then where the let's say private sectors or whoever who doesn't have any emission reduction obligation, they could develop carbon project and get the carbon credit, and it can be used to offset the emissions of those who have obligation to reduce the emissions, and which means that domestic market could become let's say the buyers of the carbon credit issued by issued from the mitigation activities. And then, of course, according to Paris Agreement, later on, once the mechanism is established, then the international carbon market could become the buyer. And then there is CORSIA, and voluntary market will still exist and expect to be exist even after the when Article 6 is in operation, because the fact is that there are a lot of private sector that also would like to see more mitigation activities implemented in many countries. This is the thing that I mentioned before about the motorcycle. It was Grab, but this one is another company that already offered the carbon offset. That's Gojek. They, for example, for now, offer planting trees to offset the emissions from using their transportation, a motorcycle or cars. But in the future, they are open for having, let's say, mitigation activities from the cities or from other form of mitigation activities. They could become the buyers of the carbon credits in the future. They are open for that. So, in conclusion, city has to take leading role in climate change mitigation by involving stakeholders from all sectors. So not only the city government, but also building owners and industries in the city, or whoever that has the possibility to reduce emissions. Mitigation actions implemented by stakeholders in the cities will support in meeting NDC targets. And then carbon finance could help in financing the mitigation actions by stakeholders. Thank you very much. I think I would end up my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very interesting presentation and very insightful on the experiences in Indonesia in terms of carbon finance and the mechanism for the CDM. There was an initial question in the chat which asks about the CDM, the method, the process, the process flow, but I believe Axel has already responded to it. So maybe I think we still have time, but before we give and go to the next presenter, Paul, can you share with us, you mentioned in your concluding remarks that cities have a major role to play when it comes to moving ahead with the mitigation targets and making finance flow in the country. How is the cities in Indonesia when it comes to relating to national government? Given the very, should I say, complex mechanisms that was applied in CDM, or was it complex for them? How was the experience by cities?
In Indonesia, because in the past, the CDM, for example, has not let's say developed carbon projects for CDM purpose, and but there, for example, buildings in the cities that could actually apply for such carbon project. We have several, let's say, companies in Indonesia that that has already implemented, let's say, mitigation activities, replacing their chillers and so on. But unfortunately, they have not done it for the carbon projects. But there's some in the CDM, for example, we remember about the program of activities that replacing light bulbs and so on. This kind of stuff, for example, could become, let's say, important thing that could be done by cities. We have seen that implemented in cities in India, and yeah, that could be one of the aspects. But in Indonesia, no cities have done it yet. So only the private sector has done it.
Thank you, Paul. And you were mentioning about Article 6 earlier, which is still being defined now. I believe Axel would have a more detailed presentation on that. But we will discuss that later. Perhaps the participants have that as a burning question. Maybe you would like to, yeah, they were asking for you to give an update on Article 6 that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I have followed some discussion lately about Article 6, but for example, when it comes to technicalities on how the let's say the baseline has to be set, how the let's say environmental integrity will be defined, and sustainability and so on. But to my understanding, there is no agreement yet on how it will be, let's say, set up yet. We expected actually that the COP this year would discuss more on this Article 6. Yeah, not much progress yet on that part. Let's say like that.
Yes, we were hoping something will be agreed last year, but to our surprise, nothing has come out. But hopefully this year we will really have a good results out of the agreement in terms of the mechanisms for finance, the markets, and the voluntary mechanism.
Correct.
So thank you very much, Paul. We will entertain all the other questions later, but for now, it is my honor if our next presenter is ready to present to you the next speaker, who's going to talk about driving ambitions and climate action through private sector collaboration. As we say, the private sector has a big role to play in making carbon finance work for cities and nations. So we have this afternoon Ms. Hannah Pike, the City, States, and Regions Lead for Asia Pacific of CDP. Hannah, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Liz, and very, very happy to be here today. I see some familiar names in the participant list, but also many new names, so it's really great to be here. And I've joined past CLP sessions in Jakarta as well, so yeah, I'm really glad to be reconnected with this forum. So my presentation today actually is kind of taking a bit of a different angle on the carbon city development, not so much talking about the specific kind of carbon financing and CDM process, but it's looking more at the development of low carbon projects within cities, how to kind of look at it in terms of working with the private sector in other ways. And maybe these projects in some way then link into the potential of developing some sort of carbon market. Sorry, is this better now? Okay, I'll try.
Yes, Hannah, it's better. It's good.
Okay, great. So before I kick off, I'm just going to introduce CDP very quickly, just so you have an idea of what it is that we do. Basically, CDP is an international not-for-profit. We run a global disclosure platform through which a number of different stakeholders disclose their climate and environment related data. So this includes city governments, subnational governments, as well as corporations across the world. So next slide, please. So this just gives you a brief overview of kind of the scale of CDP's platform. So, when we first started about 20 years ago, our key target audience were companies, and we were requesting climate change related information from them on behalf of investors. This has now evolved to include the cities and states and regions that we work with, but also we engage the companies to work with their supply chains. So you can see here that the number of companies either disclosing to their investors or to their kind of purchasing companies is quite large, reaching almost 10,000 this year. Okay, next slide, please. So just in terms of the actual cities and states and regions disclosing, this is the number that we're at as of last year. So it is a growing program. Okay, sorry, so the audio, it seems like it's not working very well. Let's see.
Okay, can lights
Hannah? Yes, while we're waiting for Hannah to fix her audio, maybe we can, should we proceed to the next speaker, or let's answer a few questions? If Paul is okay to answer, maybe there are, although I see that Axel has been very active in answering, one of our speakers is very active answering your questions, but maybe Paul, there are questions here that you can answer, like how effective is carbon credit if it's just offsets the carbon emissions? Does it just neutralize, or what was the experience in Indonesia, perhaps? Paul?
Yeah, I mean, so the carbon credit that's been used to offset emissions, but means actually that somewhere else the emission reduction, or let's say the climate change mitigation is being done. Even if let's say, or thinking about the designing of the carbon pricing that or ETS, that, for example, one company would only buy the permits or offsets from other company. If we design the ETS badly, then means people might, or company might only buy the cheap permits or carbon credit. But if the ETS is designed properly, and then the mitigation activities is done, then somewhere in the world where the carbon credit is let's say generated, the emission reduction is actually done, and that's actually the main one of the issues in the let's say CDM, that you can generate the emission reduction anywhere, and then you can use it to offset your emission as well. And I think that is done. They have been done in let's say in many countries as well, not only in Indonesia. Hello.
Okay, so I'm thinking, the slides, are you there?
Yes, I'm finally back.
Okay.
Something went wrong. Sorry. Welcome to the developing country of the Philippines. Our internet is not as stable. All of us are doing work from home. So yes, is Hannah going to continue on now?
Yes, can you hear me better now?
Yes, a lot
Okay.
better, Hannah. Please continue. Over to
Okay,
you.
great. Okay, fantastic. Yes, so actually we can go on to the next slide. Just to kind of, emphasize that, a lot of cities, as well as subnational governments, disclose their climate and environmental information for many different reasons. One of the key reasons is to be able to monitor and track against their commitments to certain initiatives, such as the Global Covenant of Mayors or the Under 2 Coalition, or to inform programs and technical assistance provided via their membership to certain networks such as C40 or ICLE, as well as others. And we also work with partners to provide additional benefits and services to cities, such as the Sustainable Infrastructure Foundation. And this subsequently drives increased action and impact in the states and regions that are being transparent about their environmental information. Next slide, please. As some of you may know, last year in 2019, we also unified our reporting system with ICLE. So this is with the goal to ensure that reporting this type of information is simpler and more streamlined. Next slide, please. And ultimately, we aim to amplify the impact of the data that's reported through the platform, through enabling other key stakeholders to utilize it, as you can see that we've tried to kind of visualize here. And anyone in the public can also access any publicly reported data through CDP's Open Data Portal. Next slide, please. And what we're really seeing is that, in addition to kind of having this data be used by partners for monitoring and tracking progress, the actual kind of process of being transparent and reporting on a consistent and regular basis enables cities to further drive action. So since the Paris Agreement came into place, we see that 90% more cities have set emissions reduction targets. Twice as many cities have since created climate action plans as well. And this is all working towards ensuring that we live in a climate safe, water secure, and deforestation free world. And this is important because these targets and these climate action plans are actually the basis for which then local authorities can start to look at what type of projects they want to implement in terms of ensuring that they're meeting their targets to reduce their emissions, as well as to become more resilient to the climate impacts that they're facing. Next, please. So next, I'm just going to talk a little bit about more around the kind of sustainable infrastructure gap in terms of climate financing. And also one of the kind of ways that we've developed to address this. So next slide, please. Yeah, so, we're seeing that the demand is absolutely there, for investors to actually invest, and also that there is a major gap, to address low carbon development. So in order to meet a low carbon scenario, there was a piece of research that was done. It's actually about 5 years old now, that identified that $93 trillion must be invested in low carbon infrastructure. At the time, it was over the next 15 years. Now we're coming up to the next 10 years if we are to meet carbon neutrality targets by 2030. This research also shows that 70% of this investment will need to be in urban areas. And as we know, which Paul mentioned in his presentation previously, cities consume approximately 75% of the world's energy and are also responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. This poses actually a huge opportunity as cities offer scale, density, and co-benefits of taking this type of action. And in addition, cities all over the world are already, showing leadership. They're already setting very bold targets on climate change. For example, a number of cities, a lot of the large cities such as London, smaller cities such as, Copenhagen, Sydney, they have all pledged to have zero emissions by 2050. So in order to achieve these ambitious goals, cities will, for the most part, then require financing to actually implement projects that will get them there. Next slide, please. So in addition, the OECD has calculated that US $6.9 trillion per year is required to up to 2030 to meet climate and development objectives. 63% of current climate finance flows are from private finance. This was identified by the Climate Policy Initiative, who do a lot of work around city climate financing. And an annual investment in low carbon energy and energy efficiency would need to increase by a factor of 5 by 2050. Next slide, please. And again, just to emphasize, that there, is a demand as well coming from the investment side. So, the International Finance Corporation identified that the Paris Agreement has created a fast-growing market for solutions and investments in low carbon and resilient infrastructure. And in addition, a G20 Green Finance study found that, while about US $1.5 trillion climate-aligned bonds existed in 2018, this was only a small fraction of the total global bond market, which is about US $100 trillion. So there's still a long way to go, and the demand is absolutely there. Next slide, please. So in end of 2018, CDP and C40's Cities Finance Facility also produced a piece of analysis based on data that was disclosed through both CDP and C40 CFF. And what we also saw was that there is a demand from cities for investing in resilient and low carbon development in cities. So you can see here that at the time that there was over 1,100 projects submitted requiring investment of around US close to $57.9 billion, and across a number of sectors such as energy and buildings, transportation, waste, and so on. Next slide, please. So the analysis also showed that projects requiring assistance are across different scales of investment, and almost half of the projects were below the US $10 million mark, which actually is considered to be on the smaller side, while 20% are above the US $100 million mark. Next slide. Cities have projects at all levels of preparation, and support is needed across all of them, particularly, I would say, at the earliest stages of project development. A third of the projects are at a preliminary stage or undergoing scoping. So support is absolutely critical here if we are to see enough projects make it to implementation in order to meet the demand that we have seen and that we talked about earlier. So next slide. So back actually in 2016, which seems like a while ago now, but at the time, city climate financing was still relatively new. It wasn't something, well, not new, but it wasn't something that had kind of made it onto a lot of investors' radars quite yet. And CDP conducted interviews with local authority representatives as well as investors, and identified the main barriers to accessing the finance needed by cities to develop projects that are low carbon. So the first barrier that was identified was that on both sides, that there's a lack of knowledge, and more often in city governments, a lack of capacity to really understand what it is that each stakeholder is seeking and coming together to develop joint objectives. And the second gap was around the fact that climate change mitigation or greenhouse gas emissions reduction is often low on the agenda for many city governments. This can be due to a number of different reasons, but often cities are tackling multiple priorities, such as providing basic services, ensuring that that there's certain services such as waste management that are improved, and so it's deemed that climate change is low on the city agenda. But actually what we have seen is that these two things don't have to be opposing to each other. They can actually come together. And thirdly, that there is also difficulty in aligning all the parties involved, and this can be beyond just the investor and the local authority. This could include, for example, engineering firms, consultancies, underwriters, and so on, as there are many different stakeholders involved in developing and implementing projects. And the last key barrier that was identified was a lack of track record or creditworthiness for cities wanting to develop these low carbon projects. So next slide, and actually we can move on to the next one as well. So out of this, CDP and in partnership with the Low Carbon City Lab at Climate Kick, developed the MATCHMAKER platform, through which cities disclose project data to CDP and partners. And this can be done through, this is kind of done already through the general information disclosure process, but we also have now the MATCHMAKER platform, which collects even more detailed information about the type of projects that cities are looking to gain financing for or secure financing for. And then we analyze this data, and we also consult with cities on the types of projects that they're looking to develop. And then on the other side, we've been working to bring on board subscribers to the platform to then gain exposure to these investment opportunities, and actually see what the types of projects that cities are putting forward, and also providing the ability to get in touch with them and try to see if there's an opportunity to develop these further. So at the bottom of the slide, you'll just see what type of, the number of projects and the investment opportunity by geographic region. So in East and Southeast Asia, we saw that 125 projects were submitted, equivalent to around US $7.2 billion. So next slide, please. So the types of projects that have been showcased through MATCHMAKER are quite varied. They range from flood controls to waste management, sustainable transportation, renewable energy, of course, is a big one, water management, energy efficiency, and so on. And a deeper look at project values per city in different continents also offered new insights. For example, 41% of the projects disclosed by cities in Latin America, are currently seeking full financing or full funding, compared to, for example, in Europe, there's around 14%, which is a lot lower. On average and per project, we saw that African cities disclose projects requiring more capital than cities in other regions, highlighting that there is a major funding gap in the region, which is also seriously threatened by climate change itself. And then here on this slide, you can see on the left-hand box, this is just the type of information that's requested through the MATCHMAKER platform. So we have a specific project intake form that asks for these specific details. So this is more information or more detailed than just what the general reporting and disclosure requests. Next slide, please. This is just a very brief screenshot to show what the MATCHMAKER platform looks like. So it's an online platform that kind of compiles all this data. The filters enable the investors or other subscribers, it's not just investors, to actually then kind of try to get down to the specifics that they're looking for, such as region or even specific countries and so on. Next slide, please. Again, just an overview of the type of projects according to the sectors that have been submitted. So yeah, 44% of the projects, as mentioned, are under, well, actually for Matchmaker, they're under kind of the $5 million mark. And over 50% of the projects that were submitted in 2019 are in the kind of earlier stages of development. So this means, they're either at scoping, pre-feasibility and feasibility stages. Next slide, please. So this is just, kind of going through the benefits, but I think, I probably don't need to go through this too much. Ultimately, when we're looking at developing low carbon infrastructure or sustainable infrastructure within cities to enable low carbon development, the financing from the private sector is absolutely key to be able to meet the kind of goals that are set under the Paris Agreement, as well as the targets that cities are setting themselves. So next slide, please. So actually, before I close off, I just briefly wanted to touch upon another way of thinking about low carbon projects and reducing emissions in cities that also involves the private sector. And this is through something called the City Business Climate Alliance. Next slide. So to provide a bit of context, following the launch of the Mayor of London's environment strategy in 2017, the Greater London Authority was keen to explore how they could work collaboratively with London's businesses to contribute to meeting the very ambitious target set by the Mayor to make London zero carbon. So out of this, CDP worked with partners such as C40, World Business Development Council for Sustainable Development, and the B team to develop the London Business Climate Leaders Initiative as a way to, basically enable the Greater London Authority to meet the zero carbon target. So the LBCL consists of businesses who have made ambitious climate commitments themselves. Also that they have a significant presence in the City of London, and that they were willing to commit to working with the Greater London Authority to translate these commitments into local climate actions based on a mutual understanding and the collective decision-making between city government and business leaders. It also aimed to serve as a blueprint for other cities wishing to form a similar alliance and engage larger businesses or a larger group of businesses in their city, particularly, for some cities, in cities that have an absence of regulatory powers over the private sector when it comes to reducing carbon emissions. Next slide. Yep, so the way that this initiative worked was to focus on 4 key areas that you can see here. So as a global business center, with obviously a very booming kind of sustainable economy, London was the ideal place to showcase how businesses can help cities drive the low carbon transition. So the initiative involved 11 leading businesses, the Mayor of London, as well as our partners who helped to do a lot of the facilitation of this work. And basically set, very ambitious targets under these 4 main areas. So for example, you can see here under sustainable buildings, the goal is to set energy efficiency targets for 2020, 2025, and 2030 in order to reach zero emission buildings by 2050. For renewable energy, the goals were to purchase 100% renewable electricity by 2020. And then map on-site renewable potential of London-based properties by this year as well. Under clean transport, the goals were to switch to zero-emission capable vehicles for company-owned vehicles in London by 2025, and support the development of EV charging as well. And then the final area is on waste and circular economy. So the aim here was to reduce waste generation by 50% by 2030 and also achieve a 75% recycling of waste and no waste to landfill by 2025. So the businesses, the 11 businesses that committed to this, split up into these different working groups and committed to these targets. And then under these working groups, there was a lot of discussion that went into understanding and kind of figuring out ways to achieve these targets as a collective, understanding that each individual business or the city authority itself would not be able to reach these targets on their own. Next slide, please. So just to say that out of this pilot project, a step-by-step guide was published for developing similar collaborations. And we're now working with a new pool of local authorities who expressed interest in developing similar alliances in their cities. And this is just another way to think about accelerating the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in your cities and enabling low carbon development that directly includes the private sector operating within your jurisdictions. So I think that's actually the end of my presentation. I don't know if we have time for questions, so I'll hand it back to Lides. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hannah. Very informative, very interesting presentation. I'm sure a lot of the participants appreciated that. At this point, we will open the floor for questions. We will now go into an open forum. We'll entertain questions coming from the participants and even coming from the rest of the panelists, if so. So Hannah, there's a specific question here for you. Could allow me to read it. Based on your experiences, what are the top three projects or policies that are simple and does not require huge budget that is effective in mitigating carbon emission, which can be implemented immediately by local governments?
This is a bit of a tricky one, I have to say, and I myself am not, the kind of investment expert that can put the specific financial values on these types of, or costs on these types of projects. But one thing I think that is a bit of a low-hanging fruit and that many cities often try to address first is around retrofitting and energy efficiency. So rather than looking to reduce emissions by developing new kind of renewable energy sources, which can often be a bit more of a complex project to develop, many cities will often go to looking at how they can start retrofitting existing buildings, whether they first look at tackling residential sector first or commercial, and then providing incentives as well for those residents or for the businesses to start, actually changing some of the existing infrastructure to more energy efficient technology and so on. So I would say that tends to be one of the first areas that many cities look to focus on first.
Thank you, Hannah. In your presentation, you talked about the 4 challenges. I mean, the report you referred to was, as you said, back in 2016, where there's capacity challenge, there are bottlenecks when it comes to mitigation not being a priority of cities. But there's one interesting part there, which is like to me a catch-22. If the track record and the creditworthiness of cities a major bottleneck for them to receive finance, but if they don't get finance, then they wouldn't be able to establish it as well. So how are their experiences of how that was overcome by cities? What are the major steps or initiatives that cities can do to address that bottleneck? Are there any CDP reporting cities who have gone through it and overcome that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've actually started piloting is more targeted cohort training, where we bring in very specific case studies of projects that have been financed and bring in the different stakeholders to try to do like a 360 case study view on it. So bring in, the city government, potentially the engineering firms that worked on this project, the financiers, also, there's other stakeholders such as underwriters that are involved. So basically looking at these specific case studies and trying to take the best practices and knowledge from them and enabling other cities to learn from these. So that's actually a very new area that we're trying to tackle as well.
is definitely challenging. But, there's other great organizations that are also looking to build up the capabilities of cities. I think one that's very well known in our region is CDIA. They support a lot of cities in doing pre-feasibility studies and so on. So I think, there's now a kind of ecosystem of organizations working to help build more capacity for cities, and also bring the other stakeholders, such as the engineers and the financiers, to the table. So there's a better kind of dialogue happening as well.
Yeah, a follow-up question to you, Hannah, and maybe Paul can answer this too. What are the best practices in engaging the private sector and bringing them into the city projects? Because London might have worked, but in Asia, what are the mechanisms? What are the initiatives that city needs to do to really encourage private sector engagement in the climate actions that they have planned?
Yeah, this is a tricky one because I think it's quite context specific. It depends on a number of different factors, and also what kind of national context you're in, what type of city you are, and what type of businesses, what are your main industries, and therefore what are the type of businesses that operate within your jurisdiction. But I think, a lot of what cities do already involve a great deal of stakeholder consultation. So this is just another way to think about how you can engage your stakeholders, and the business sector, when it comes to thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, absolutely have to be involved anyway. When you're, setting your emissions reduction targets, when you develop your climate action plans. And so they would have been hopefully engaged throughout those processes, so that when you're ready to develop projects and think about, how to set these ambitious targets and bring in that sector, there's already been some groundwork done, in terms of engaging them. And this isn't kind of coming out of the blue, that they're aware of the ambitions that the city government has, and aware of the type of, goals and targets that have been set. And so, there should be kind of a continuous engagement process throughout all of these steps.
Perhaps echoing that it's good business to be partners with the city in doing low carbon development initiatives, right? So, and sometimes it's not as easy for cities to communicate that indeed doing and having a partnership with them is not just good for the city and the overall development of a particular sector, but it's actually good in the business sense, because their bottom lines would also be achieved if such is done. So perhaps it's communicating the partnership is a big challenge to most, but it's something that has to be, really done. Paul, insights on private sector engagement and even perhaps engaging other sectors in government, civil society. What's the challenge and how can it be resolved? How can we bring more partnerships into helping cities access finance?
Yeah, I have seen, for example, in Jakarta, Ibu Aisa knows that better than me. For example, in the construction of the waste treatment plant, where they use to capture the methane gas and generate electricity with that. The open bidding for waste to energy project has been conducted last time, and several private sector actually come and submit their offer. This is, let's say, a kind of successful collaboration with the government. Even at the end, the project has not been so successful yet, but the engagement between the government and the private sector is there through a proper business process. But if we look at the example of Bali, for example, the governor has issued a kind of regulation saying that by this year's all the energy has to come from renewable energy, or the emission should be reduced and so on. So governor of Bali has issued this regulation by 2030, I think, or 35. The renewable energy should be dominated in Bali. They are interested in doing that because it is of interest for the tourism. So a proper regulation that's supported by the government will be supported by private sector as well. At the end, the private sector would be happy to see that they can do the business with the proper, let's say, business process without later on being charged of accused of doing not so good business. So a proper business process is actually the key to let's say involving the private sector in the city activities.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Yes. So, quick question. I think this is a good segue to the next session. Someone is asking information on prevailing carbon price. Does it differ? Is it different per region or per country? Quick response maybe from Hannah or Paul if you have information on that. But I believe in the next session, those details are still going to be covered. But quickly, carbon pricing perhaps, is it different across region or per country?
I mean, in general, in carbon pricing, we have several options, either carbon ETS or carbon tax. But to solve or to meet the emission reduction target, combination of policy or instruments will be required. We see, for example, that ETS is implemented in EU, but in some countries also they have this carbon tax. So there is no single instrument to be used in one countries, and in Southeast Asia, for example, Singapore started with carbon tax. In Korea, they have ETS. In China, they have ETS. But in future, we will see the combination between ETS and carbon tax.
Slides, you're mute, please.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Paul. Hannah, any insights on carbon pricing and what are the efforts being done on carbon pricing across the region and countries?
So this isn't something maybe I am an expert in, so I won't give any like false information. I'm worried to do that. But one thing that we have done actually, for consistently in the annual disclosure for corporates is to ask if they have set an internal price on carbon. And this is, proven. So there's actually a report that was published on this a few years ago, but this has proven to be very useful insight because one, companies in the private sector are have been increasingly, trying to set their own price on carbon. And trying to really, this is a really interesting exercise because how do you put a dollar figure on something like carbon? But the fact that they are trying to do it has shown that the need for some sort of globally recognized pricing system is needed. And the other issue is that without that there is kind of discrepancy that is hindering the process of being able to have, kind of more solidified, unified market for, trading carbon. So that is just maybe one piece of insight I can give. But in terms of what the actual price is for carbon, that's not something that I can speak on.
Yeah, thank you. So I think given this discussion and this question, it's time for us to hear more from the expert on this. And his discussion will talk about experiences of cities with international carbon markets and recommendations for future involvement. I think it's going to focus about the future of Article 6. How can we move ahead given the issues of access and given the issues institutionally? So without further ado, let's give the floor to Mr. Alex Michaeloa. He's the senior founding partner of Perspectives Climate Group, to share with us his insights on the topic. Axel,
yes, thank you very much, Leda. So I'm really happy to talk to you just on the previous question. Of course, there are good reports that summarize the development of carbon pricing. I would recommend the report of the ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership, or the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing that has been published every year by the World Bank. So these give you the overview of all the prices of emission trading schemes, of the carbon taxes, and of the emission credits from the baseline credit systems. I will now start my presentation. Give me one moment for bringing up the slides. Good. I hope you see everything, right? Does it work?
Yes, we're seeing it.
Good, perfect. So, of course, Paul, who has been a long-term carbon market expert, has already mentioned that there are different kinds of carbon markets, and I want to be very clear here because there's often a lot of confusion. So I'm talking about the international carbon markets, of which the first generation was defined by the Kyoto Protocol. So they've generated the clean development mechanism and other mechanisms that are only relevant for industrialized countries. So for your region, only clean development mechanism is relevant. And then we have what we call the Paris mechanisms under the Paris Agreement with the so-called Article 6, the market mechanism article, which has two components. One are the so-called cooperative approaches, Article 6.2, and what is often called, it's not the formal term, but it is a better term than the formal term, Sustainable Development Mechanism, or Article 6.4. And of course, there is a flurry of voluntary carbon market activities. For example, some of you may have heard of the Voluntary Carbon Standard, VCS, or VERA, or the Gold Standard. But yeah, these are not related to any international agreement. They are purely for private sector voluntary offsetting. And I want to focus on what is the experience of cities in the CDM. It has been mentioned a bit on the side already. And on some work we've been doing together with ICLEI, how cities could engage in Article 6. So here, just the formal rules of Article 6. So the cooperative approaches under 6.2, they allow bilateral or multilateral collaboration between countries, which generate a very nasty acronym, Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcome, or ITMO, but these would be the carbon credits under Article 6. And what is important to understand, that this would not have any international oversight. So it means essentially that each country can do what it wants. Whereas the Article 6.4 would be very much like the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. It has the same both targets, mitigation and sustainable development, and it will have international oversight. Unfortunately, the international process has not been able to agree on detailed rules for these mechanisms. Now, for 3 years in a row, the negotiations have been ongoing. Of course, COVID crisis has led to the deferral of the COP26 to next year. So that's a pity, because essentially it means a lot is in limbo. But nevertheless, there is a number of actors who is starting to pilot Article 6 activities. What I should also state, there are two main principles. So the one principle is environmental integrity. So the emission credit should be real, additional, and so on. And that there should be a good degree of transparency about what is being done. CDM, of course, has already been a model of transparency. All the documents are available on the website of the UNFCCC. So that's, of course, important to understand what's being done. Now, a few years ago, I looked into the whole pipeline of CDM projects and see which of those projects have actually been organized by municipalities. And to be very clear, municipality really means the office of the mayor or the city administration. And this was very disappointing because these projects were a tiny, tiny minority, less than 1%. And then there was an interesting category that in China, apparently many cities have specific city administered companies that, for example, do electric power development, and those gave another 1%. But it shows that CDM somehow, at least for the city administrations, has not been a success. Now, of course, we did look a bit broader together with ICLE in the project for the German Federal Environmental Agency. And we looked into what of the projects actually have been undertaken in urban sectors. So it's not looking into who actually organized the projects, but whether they happened in such a sector. So, of course, most of them would be undertaken by private sector, but it shows that here that turnout is much better. About 1/5 of the CDM projects relate to activities that are usually happening in urban areas. And about 20% of those projects actually had been able to issue carbon credits. And one needs to say that the performance in terms of the number of credits compared to the forecasts before the project was actually started, that of course is very mixed. So you see energy projects had really bad performance in cities. Waste projects were relatively good. Transport were mixed. What one needs to say that usually the performance of private sector CDM projects is around 90+%. So it shows that urban areas had problems with actually undertaking CDM. What are the barriers? And some of them have already been mentioned. One needs to say that most of the urban sectors are rather diffuse. Transport involves many actors, many emission sources. Same for buildings, same for waste. Whereas, for example, an electric utility project is very centralized. So these diffuse sectors, of course, require that you organize a lot of players and you have a lot of potential inefficiencies if you interact with them. Then, of course, the generic challenge that such activities usually lead significant upfront investments. And given that under the international market mechanisms for greenhouse gas reduction, you usually get the money ex-post and not ex-ante, you have to overcome this barrier of financing. And it has been mentioned by my colleague from CDP. Then, of course, mostly in urban administrations and also companies working in the urban sector, institutional capacity is a challenge. And if I look now into the kind of ecosystem of the CDM, there are, of course, specialized consultants. For example, Paul in the past worked for a consultancy called South Pole, a lot of specialists there. My own firm has been doing a lot of CDM work in the past 15 years. So, of course, it's clear that a city administration can never be as specialized as these consultants. One needs to say that CDM procedures can be complex. You've seen the graph shared by Paul on the project cycle. And one aspect that is a big difference to the private sector is that in cities, you often have these election cycles. So the mayor is elected for, let's say, 4 years. So the mayor tries to do things that can be visible in 4 years. Then the next mayor comes and does completely different things. So of course, a CDM project that may have a lifetime of 20 years, of course, is difficult to undertake under such conditions. But now I want to give you a glimpse into a really good success story of an urban CDM project, and this is about Delhi Metro. So Delhi is, of course, a huge metropolis of about 16 million people, so really among #1 cities in the world in terms of inhabitants. And whoever has been in Delhi knows that transport is a real nightmare. And for many years, people believed it can't be resolved. But this Delhi Metro is a huge success in terms of working on transport problems in Delhi. And I think it has been one of the fastest growing systems of public transport anywhere in the world, even surpassing things that have been done in China. So you see, within only half a decade, hundreds of kilometers of metro lines have been built, and also the growth in passengers is really very much significant. And of course, we don't know how COVID now impacts on the further expansion, but it is scheduled to expand really significantly. And Delhi Metro administration has been using the CDM, and not only for one activity, but for a whole cluster, and for a cluster of very different activities. So they started with a small project, which relates to the braking systems of the metro trains, because they would recover electricity. And this project has been running really well. It issued about 40,000 credits per year, and it has had a performance of above 100%. So big success. Of course, the overall quantity is smaller than many other CDM projects, but it worked well. And on the basis of the experience they developed with this project, they then went into a really large scale, because they used a new methodology to actually now calculate how many people have shifted from car to metro, and what is the emission reduction effect of that shift. And that is now really a big one, 500,000 credits per year. And again, it has an overperformance, and which is significant. 135% of the expected credits are being generated. Then in 2014, another one of these transport modal shifts for the new expansions. So you see even a larger number of credits, but these have not yet done any issuance, because the CDM market price has not been very attractive since 2013. And then the last but not least one, renewable energy, because this metro has, of course, a lot of depots and buildings. So they are putting photovoltaics on these buildings, and they have now a project of 15 megawatt, so significant scale. And they already did the monitoring, but they have not yet issued the credits. So just to give here the example of the large project, how the performance developed over time. So you see, initially in the first years, the performance was less than expected, but then from the third year onward, it really did an overperformance, which has been consistent over the years. And interestingly, compared to many other partners in the CDM who stopped the issuance of credits after the price came down in 2012, 2013. The Delhi Metro is still making the issuance. So it believes that the market has a future, and it offers these credits on the free market. So here, and this is very interesting, because usually the revenues from the CDM are private secret. Normally companies don't publish them, but the Delhi Metro company is very transparent. And in an annual report, you can find the revenues from the sale of the credits from the CDM project. So you see that in the years between 2010 and 2014, they regularly sold credits, and they generated about €1.5 million of revenues. But as, of course, the market has not been attractive from that time, they've not been able to sell since then. So that, of course, shows that it's a market, and the market can be in the doldrums. And of course, CDM has had real trouble getting new demand for its credits. And that's, of course, when even the best developers like Delhi Metro have no chance. They need to wait until the price picks up again. So now, of course, I want to go into Article 6 how could the city engage in this Article 6? The first issue, of course, is Article 6 wants to be an upscaled mechanism, so it can go beyond specific projects. It can cover entire territories. So now, of course, the question is, how do we define the territory? Or do we have a definition that relates to emission costs? So, for example, for waste, taking the flows of waste, or for transport, taking also the people who commute into the city. And then the big question, it has already been raised by Paul, how do we align with the nationally determined contribution, with the country's emission target? So, because usually the central government of a country always takes the emission reductions that are generated by city and somehow expropriates them, because well, the city is not asked whether the government can calculate this emission reduction in its own NDC. So ideally, but this of course would require a very enlightened central government, you should define a city sector of the NDC, and then this sector could be developed in the market itself. But of course, this is crucial to specify what incentive a city actually has to engage. And of course, you need to have good methodologies for calculating the emission reductions and to standardize them. For example, World Bank for the city of Amman has tried to do a standardized approach. So far, it's not clear whether it will fly, but it gives some interesting ideas. Of course, you also need the good MRV. CDP has shared some experiences on MRV, so that's of course an initial basis, but I think it would have to be built into more detail. You need to understand how the social integrity relevance the benefits for the population. And then of course the additionality and the financial incentives need to be brought in. I think city networks like the one organizing this event can be important facilitators for Article 6. So to conclude, so far involvement of the municipalities themselves and actors within cities in the international carbon market has been a bit disappointing, but there are success stories. I gave you the New Delhi one. There's another one from Sao Paulo. They had various big landfills capturing methane, and they generated $20 million of revenue that went into city level activities. So there, I think it was the biggest city level engagement in the CDM on the whole world. Article 6 offers new opportunities, more sector-based, upscaled, but of course cities need to be bold to take them up. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Axel. Interesting discussion. I think there's a particular feedback here that the participants said that they agree with the barriers to engagement. And one thing that they'd like added to that is that understanding of the overall long-term benefits of such projects by the heads of municipalities should be added. Quick feedback on that, Axel.
Well, what I would think is that if one can make the mayor of a city understand what potential benefits of international carbon markets for the city are, and then have a pervasive approach throughout the city administration, then cities are really well placed. And for example, if it's clear that there is, let's say, a big transportation activity coming up, like a metro system, then early enough, try to understand where you can bring in the revenue from the international carbon market, also in the structuring of the financial closure of the project. And then also, in many cities, you have good expertise in the private sector. So for example, just look into Jakarta. I think in Jakarta, there's at least a dozen of good international carbon market experts in half a dozen of companies. There's Paul, there's the South Pole people, there is Agosari, for example, there's Chitra from Castle Rock. So there is sufficient experience. Bring in these experts and develop the strategy, and then knock the doors of your national government. Tell them, look, we as a city, we want to be involved, but we need to be sure that you as central government don't take away the benefits. So we need to agree on a benefit sharing from these international market approaches.
Thank you, Paul. last question, similarly, you talked about revenues. In designing a project and engaging experts, there's those immediate investments that might be needed when structuring the project. So how is that? I mean, that's a lot of cities are asking about that. Where do we get that initial resource to get into project development and bring in experts? What's your experience on it? How is that funded at the onset?
Well, of course, I would say one should try to make a blending of various sources of finance. So, for example, there is what is called the NAMA facility of Germany, UK, and Denmark. So they allow to actually set up a project for between, let's say, $15 to $20 million. For scaling up mitigation, of course, on the national level, but it could also be used for cities. And this then could be used as to enable the upfront funding for parts of the activities. And once you then have shown that the concept works, then you could bring in the carbon market finance as co-funding. So look into this really broad landscape of climate-related financing and see how you can combine the various sources. And some of them will be upfront and others will then provide revenues as a project goes on stream.
Thank you very much, Axel. I'm sure the participants got a lot of insights from you. We will have more opportunities to ask you later, but for now, last but not least, we would have a speaker from the Science and Technology and International Cooperation Division of Beijing Municipal Ecology of Environment and Environment Bureau to talk about Beijing's experience on emission trading. We have Ms. Chunmei Li to share with us their experiences in Beijing on ETS. Chunmei, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm honored to join this climate leadership program, and I will share my PPT file. And today I will give us a brief introduction about Beijing's experience on emission trading scheme. I will, in three contents. The first is the background, then I will introduce the practice and experience Beijing has done in the last 5 or 6 years. And finally, I will give a brief outlook of Beijing emission trading system. Firstly, I will give a brief introduction about Beijing. As you know, according to Beijing Master Plan, Beijing is being built into political, culture, technical innovation, and an international communication center. By 2019, the residents is 21 million, and the GDP is about 500 billion USD dollars, and the GDP per capita is about 24,000 US dollars. And the area, Beijing is a big city. The area is about 16,000 square kilometers. I just want to brief introduction of Beijing. As you know, yesterday, Chinese President Xi has made the remarks in a speech at the general debate of the 75th session of UN General Assembly via video link. He said greenhouse gas emission reduction is China's long-term policy. China willing to contribute more to the fight against climate change as it and bring carbon emissions to a peak by 2030. And achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 with more forceful policies and measures. This is the newest, the update news from China. It's about our new target. And how about Beijing? The Beijing target as in the 13th five-year plan, we have two targets. The first one is that the carbon intensity of 2020 should be reduced by 20.5% relative to 2015. Second is that carbon emission to a peak level by 2020 in Beijing. The third one is that we want to co-benefit from air pollution control measures. As you know, Beijing still has, as a developing city, Beijing has a lot of pressure from air pollution control. So Beijing still in the 14th next five-year plan, Beijing still will fight very hard with air pollution. So those measures in energy field and transportation field, all of those measures will contribute to the carbon reduction. On 2012, the central government has decided to set up 7 pilot emission trading system as a pilot project for the whole national emission trading system. Beijing is one of them. So on November of 2013, Beijing emission trading system is formally launched. Until now, about 7 years, after 7 years work, we have developed 3 phases of the market. After 2 years preparation of the preparation of work, since 2013 to 2015, in these 3 years, we have the phase 1 part of the market. We formally started the emission trading market. During that time, those 3 years, we have about 400 entities in the market. At that time, the entrance limit is that only cover stationary source, and those the amount of emission is about 10,000 tons. Then on year 2015, Beijing started phase 2 market. We expand the market area. Except for the stationary sources, we also add mobile sources. For example, the metro and also the bus company are included into the Beijing market. And also we lower the entrance limit to 500 tons. If a company entity in Beijing, the carbon emission source is higher than 500 tons, it will be mandatory in Beijing emission trading system. Then this is the second phase. Then we go to the third phase at the end of 2018. This emission trading system from Beijing NRDC to Beijing Ecology and Environment Bureau. Since we need to combine the carbon emission reduction work together with air pollution control, so we do a lot of fine management work in the Beijing emission trading system. We changed the base year from the new base year as 2016 to 2018. All the benchmark are further some total number as based on this new base period. And we also include the aviation enterprise, ask them to report all data in the market. since 2012, Beijing has done a lot of work on the top level design for the Beijing ETS. We call our principle as 1+1+N system of policies and regulation. The first one as a regulation. The second one as rules from the Beijing government. The last N means a number of policies from Beijing Ecology and Environment Bureau. We have totally about 20 rules for the management of the whole Beijing ETS. All these policies guaranteed the strict operation of the market with scientific quota allocation mechanism, scientific third-party verification system, and flexible offset mechanism, open market operation, and strict law enforcement. This is the milestone of Beijing ETS. Secondly, about carbon market management process. In Beijing, we have 6 steps for the entities in Beijing ETS pilot project. The first one is reporting. The first step is reporting. All the enterprise in the market should report their carbon emission each year. And the second step after the report, the report is in the system, in the platform of Beijing ETS. We will ask the enterprise to invite a third party to verify their data. The third part that, according to the reporting data and the third-party verification data, Beijing Ecology and Environment Bureau will issue allowances to each entity in the market. Then the entity will have the chance about 2 months period. They have the time period to trade the allowance. If they are short, they can buy some allowances. If they are surplus, they can sell. Then we have Beijing Bureau will determine a surrounding time limit. Then the company will surrender their allowance to the government. If some company they delay the surrounding activity after the time limit, Beijing will send the enforce law team to give company some punishment, as mainly about the refinement. This slide, I will give us some facts about Beijing ETS. The entrance limit, just now I will give us some introduction. The entrance limit, the entities with annual carbon emission over 5,000 tons will be mandatory in Beijing ETS. Until now, nearly 900 entities in the market, in Beijing ETS market. Beijing ETS covers about 40% of Beijing total greenhouse gas emission. Until now, Beijing only include carbon dioxide in the market. We are thinking about methane, but until now it is not included. And now there are we control 7 fields, including power plant, heat, cement, petrochemical companies, and public transportation. Service In fact, services mainly about the buildings, the energy efficiency in the buildings, and also other industries. Beijing ETS is a little different from EU ETS. In EU ETS, we know that they only include the facility, the big emission volume facility. But in Beijing, we include the company, the whole company. So all the emission in the whole entity or company is under control. Not only the main facility, it's the include all the emission in each company. The fourth part I will introduce about allowance in Beijing ETS. In Beijing ETS, when we issue allowances, we consider both the equity and the reasonability for each companies in the Beijing ETS. Our allocation is a floor allocation at first, and Beijing, the government is considering auction in the near future. But until now, all the first issuance is free. And about allowance method, we have a benchmark method and grandfather method. These two methods is also almost as the same as the loss methods in EU ETS and the other ETS. But Beijing has also developed a temporary historical intensity. This method is we use this method is to collecting data for future benchmark. The fifth point, I will introduce the offset credits. The last slide, I introduced the allowance in Beijing ETS. Allowance is a mandatory requirement, but for offset, it's a voluntary activity to promote the market liquidity. In Beijing ETS, we allow a company use 5% offset credits to surrender their allowance. We have different kinds of offset credits in Beijing ETS, including local forest sink, cross-regional forest sink. CCER is a product from central government of China, and low carbon transportation reduction. These offset credits provide a flexible way for entities to surrender their carbon duty, and at the same time also improve the market liquidity. As you know, the carbon market is not as active as those bonds. So we need to develop some more credits to increase the activity of the carbon market. In this slide, I will introduce a very interesting project in Beijing to encourage public participation into the low carbon transportation. Beijing government developed I call it a party-style project. We develop a method and a platform to calculate and collect the carbon emission reduction of a trip of each person by walk, bicycle, or public bus. Then the representative of the platform can collect this carbon emission reduction amount together and trade it in the Beijing ETS and refund the money they get to the public. This party-style project just started 2 weeks ago, but it introduced many citizens to travel by low carbon transportation. It's very interesting. for the city. And then finally, I will briefly introduce the Beijing market performance. First, I will use a company data to give us a case study introduction. This is about a Beijing company. It is called the Beijing Public Transportation Corporation Company. This is a city-owned company. It's provide most of the public service in public transportation service in Beijing. As you can see, the upper photo, the upper diagram on the right is the green part as used energy as electricity, the red one as natural gas, and the blue one as diesel gas. After years ago, since 2016 to 2019, the natural gas and electricity is increasing. At the same time, the diesel is decreasing. And then, according to this energy emission, energy use, we can see the lower diagram. The blue one as the emission, and the red one, the red column as the quota. You can see that in 2016, this company as the quota of this company is negative. This company should buy some quota from the market, but in 2017 and 2018. When they use cleaner energy, more natural gas, more electricity, the quota of this company is surplus than the emission. So they can sell the quota on the market. And in 2019 and 2020, I think they, according to our forecasting, they can sell their quota for quite a few years. So this is, I choose this company as a case study for for this lecture, is that I want to say that in this market in Beijing ETS, it can help the company to reduce their, to push the company to reduce their emission, carbon emission voluntarily. So during 2016 to 2029, this company, Beijing Public Transport's diesel carbon emission ratio changed from 57% to 32%, decreased nearly about half, with carbon emission intensity decreased about 10%. And since 2018, this company quota surplus for 2 years, and also according to forecasting next 2 years. This slide is about the market performance, the price and turnover and the volume of Beijing market. Since the market is launched on November of 2013, until now, more than 62 million tons of carbon allowance and offset credits have been traded in Beijing ETS, with a turnover of nearly about 1.7 billion RMB yuan. Among them, about 36 million tons of carbon allowances were traded, with a turnover of about 1.5 billion RMB yuan. The average price is about 60 yuan per ton. And as you can see in Beijing, the price of the quota is quite stable and a little bit high in the price. This is a very good sign for the city management. With this good sign, the company in the market will voluntarily take a lot of measures to reduce their carbon emission and conserve energy. Beijing, by establishing a carbon emission trading market, raised the awareness on energy conservation and carbon emission reduction to those key carbon dioxide emitters, enhanced their awareness in low carbon work, and provided an alternative for them to fulfill their responsibilities of energy conservation and carbon reduction. We will improve the carbon emission trading system and speed up the building of climate smart low carbon cities in the future. And according to China's national ETS plan, Beijing will transfer 13 power plants from Beijing ETS to China's national ETS in about 2 years. And also Beijing is considering including cargo truck fleet and aviation enterprise mandatory into Beijing ETS system. Thank you very much. This is my speech today.
Thank you very much, Chun-Lei. Very interesting. We see that the experience of Beijing is really a good case in terms of cities acting locally, coming up with an ETS that provides incentives, and more than the finance, it's really engaging everybody into the system that in the end contributes to the reduction of emissions coming from the city. A question, Chun-Lei, if I am to ask you, what about the biggest challenge that of the Beijing ETS is experiencing and how that was resolved? Can you name at least two?
The biggest challenge, I think, since Beijing ETS has a principle to issue allowance. We call it strict and stringent. It means totally the 900 enterprise in the market. The emission of them is about 55 million tons. But when we issue the allowance, we will issue 200 million short. So most of so we push them very hard to reduce their emission. So the company, sometimes they feel, especially when they face some financial problem, they think if they need to buy those allowance from the market, they should pay the cost. So sometimes they fight very hard with us.
Yeah. So the system is really continuing to, I mean, there are situations that private sector really face, and the system has to look at that beyond the numbers that they give, because there are like companies having problems, getting into their commitment and also getting into the system and staying into the system. So congratulations to Beijing for that very good case. And I hope other cities learn a lot from your experiences. Well, of course, Beijing is bigger than most cities in Asia, but we hope that the lessons you've learned can be shared and can be an inspiration to others. So I think one of our speakers needed to leave right away, but I'm sure, and he was very active in answering your questions over the chat and in the Q&A button. So, but he has another appointment, so he had to excuse himself. So right now I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box and nor in the chat. But maybe last question to all our speakers. Parting words. Carbon finance. Cities, I mean, based on your experiences, based on your presentation, cities have a lot of contributions to do. There are resolutions that can come from cities, and cities can participate nationally, internationally in the carbon finance market, and there are a lot of opportunities of partnership. So what can you advise cities and urban stakeholders now, considering that we are in an urban world and a lot of activities and a lot of actions would still be done in cities? What can cities do to ensure that while they are benefiting from a carbon finance, they would also benefit others, other cities, other targets in terms of sustainable development? What can they do to look at it holistically, look at carbon finance as an opportunity for sustainable development, and how can they benefit from partnerships? Last words. Paul, we'll have Paul, Hannah, and then Chunlei.
Yeah, if I may start. Yeah, I'm actually would like to refer to the case of Jakarta. I'm not remember, but Ibu Aisyah could tell me later on. When in Jakarta introduced the busway, that's the bus with dedicated lane. Actually, we promoted that as one of the city actions that could qualify for carbon finance. We have discussed with several people last time on that, but ended up of doing nothing. The same thing with the construction of MRT in Jakarta, but no one take care about on the carbon finance for that. I'm sure there are a lot of examples of activities in the city government, even be it, for example, for replacing the street lighting or other activities that has been conducted. The issue is sometimes the city government did not pay much attention on what could be done to let's say to get carbon finance. Maybe that's one of the issue why the city government with all the activities that have already been conducted and that has potential to get carbon finance, but they have not do it. So I think one of the important issues, just like what the CityNet has been done so far, is actually communicating on the benefit of the carbon finance to city government would be one very important issues actually, so that they later on can realize the potentials, not only what have been done, but maybe on their future activities. I could take another example from Jakarta. They are preparing a kind of signing contract to let's say to build waste to energy project, but no one actually let's say have thought about how to claim carbon credit out of it. So capacity building, communications, and would be the key for collaborating with others. I think so, yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Hannah, and as you answer, maybe you can also address this final question, I think. What would be the possible solutions for the least developed countries? How can they benefit from carbon financing? How can they work on it? What are the emerging actions being done? Maybe through your matchmaking, or yeah. Go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, thanks, Lades. Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Because my audio is through my phone, so sorry about that. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and that piece around thinking about things holistically is really important. So I would actually say you almost have to kind of start from the initial steps to ensure that you have identified where your sources of emissions are actually coming from within the city's boundary. So that means compiling, greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and then understanding, where are the opportunities for reducing the emissions, and ensuring that there's a mechanism to track emissions reductions, because without this kind of first fundamental step, it's almost impossible to actually develop any projects that can potentially feed into some sort of carbon market. So that is quite critical for cities to ensure that they've done these initial steps, and then out of that they then identify what are the types of projects that make sense for them, because I don't think all cities, there isn't a one size fits all. And so I don't think all cities should be thinking about, the same types of projects just because they're, reducing emissions. I think there has to be quite a concerted assessment done to evaluate whether such a, like ETS or some sort of CDM process is actually suitable for that city, and also, what type of emissions reduction, low carbon projects are also suitable. So I think my advice is really actually to kind of start from those initial steps and make sure that those are properly done before kind of jumping into the more sophisticated and advanced stages. On the point around least developing countries, I think this probably applies, it's the same methodology. So, to think about what the possible solutions could be, you kind of have to start from that beginning process to understand, where are the emissions coming from, and then therefore where are the opportunities to reduce and what sectors should be focused on. Because if you know that most of your emissions are coming from, for example, the transportation sector, there might not be much sense to focus on a waste to energy plant, for example. You have to kind of weigh up all these different factors.
Thank you, Hannah, for those insights. And finally, Ms. Chunmei, if you are to advise cities who are with us today and practitioners who are with us today on moving forward in terms of looking at opportunities from from carbon finance, from doing mitigation actions, what can you tell them?
At first, you know that Beijing ETS as a pilot market. It's until now it is still a pilot market. So in China we have 7 pilot market until now, but only Beijing and Shenzhen we build laws for our carbon market. After 7 years work, we finally the result tells us that if you want to build a ETS in your city, first building a law for this ETS. Without law, without market. With the other 5 province, they built the pilot ETS, but they didn't set up a law for their ETS. So until now, the price of their ETS is very low. And also, they have no tools to punish those enterprise if they don't they don't surrender their allowance. So their work, this is my first suggestion. The second suggestion is that I think I noticed that the cities in today, we are all of us as developing cities. So for a developing cities, I think that we really can't afford to put a lot of money directly to reduce the carbon, but we can co-benefit with other measures. For example, for Beijing, since we have a lot of pressure for air pollution control, so after 5 years work with air pollution control, the energy from coal to clean energy, and also the heavy polluting enterprises are relocated from Beijing to other cities. So those highly energy conserving enterprises not in Beijing. So the carbon emission is also lowered down very fast. So I think the co-benefit, you can check what is the other most emergent mission in your country. You can co-benefit with them. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Lee. I think we have run over time. It was a very interesting discussion. I hope the participants learned a lot. But as a parting word, one thing that I'd like to leave everybody is that doing carbon finance is not just doing it for climate change. It's investing in your future, looking at sustainable development and looking at it holistically. There are lots of opportunities for partnerships, for CityNet to work with city networks to gain from the experiences of Beijing, Jakarta, the work done in London, the work in Delhi that Axel shared. And those are, it's not as if you can immediately just copy it, but looking at what you have, your own emissions, what you have that you can gain from is something that where you can start from and then use it, aggregate it together with other cities and explore the opportunities to address the issue, because cities have a lot to do and our hope for addressing climate change. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much to the CityNet Secretariat for organizing this. And thank you very much to all the speakers for your wonderful presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Polly.
Okay, thank you, Lights, for your excellent facilitation. And we thank our resource speaker, Axel, Hannah, Chunmei, Paul. Special mention to our Deputy Secretary General, Ibo Isa, who's here in our CLP session too. And we've received a lot of questions. We thank our participants also for their active participation. So that wraps up our CLP session 2 for this afternoon. Please don't forget to give us your feedback for our participants, and we'll see you on Friday for our last session, CLP session 3. And thank you and have a good day ahead of you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.